My name is Margaret Maggie Thompson, and at 67, I'm a widowed homemaker who emptied my savings to give my only son the wedding he wanted. The money wasn't the part that hurt. It was the moment his bride called me a troublemaker, and my son stood silent while strangers stared. That was the centre of my life's conflict right there at the chapel door. I smoothed my dress, kept my voice steady, and sent a single word from my phone. One word, and the room began to lean in my direction. I won't explain that yet. I'll just tell you this: the necklace on her neck was mine, and the truth was closer than anyone knew. To understand how I reached that doorway and that message, we have to go back to the first small doubt. I had given everything I could for this wedding, not because I cared about grand decorations or expensive gowns, but because I wanted my son to have a start in life that was filled with love and hope. George, my husband, had been gone for 3 years now, and since the day we buried him, the house had been quiet in a way that never stopped aching. I had promised him before he died that I would take care of Daniel, that no matter what, our boy would not face the world alone. This wedding, I told myself, was a part of that promise. The truth is, I had spent $100,000 on this day. Every penny of George's life insurance, every bond we had tucked away, even a loan against the little house we built together. My hands shook when I signed those papers, but I whispered that it was worth it. Daniel deserved joy. He deserved to walk into marriage not with worry or struggle, but with the feeling that his parents had carried him as far as they could. That thought gave me courage, even as fear of the future pressed against me. Daniel came by later with Rebecca. They looked radiant together. He smiled in a way I had not seen since before George's illness, as if the years of grief had been lifted from his shoulders. Rebecca leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and her voice was warm when she turned to me and said, "Mom." The words slipped from her lips with such ease that for a moment my heart believed it was true that I had been given a daughter after all these years. That night, after they left, I opened the velvet box that had sat in my dresser drawer for decades. Inside was the pearl necklace passed down through 4 generations of women in our family. I remembered my own mother fastening it around my neck on the night before my wedding, her voice telling me, "Give this only to someone truly worthy." My throat tightened as I lifted it from its place. The pearls seemed to glow in the light of the lamp as though they carried the touch of every woman who had worn them before me. When I gave the necklace to Rebecca the next day, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered that she would treasure it like a daughter treasures her mother's gift. She clasped it around her throat, her fingers brushing the pearls, and she looked at me with gratitude so perfect that I believed every word. I felt proud, even blessed, to think that George might be watching us and smiling at the choice I had made. Later, in the quiet of my living room, I stood before George's photograph on the mantel. I told him what I had done. I told him about the house I had risked, the savings I had spent, and the necklace I had given away. My voice trembled, but I promised him it was all for love, for Daniel, for the life we had wanted him to have. I sat by the window as night settled around me, the air cool on my face, and I thought about Daniel's smile, the way Rebecca's hand fit so naturally into his. I wanted to believe it was real. I wanted to believe this wedding would heal the years of grief and carry our son into a brighter future. The money, the sacrifices, the necklace, they were not about luxury. They were about love. That was the story I told myself as I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair, weary but proud. I had no way of knowing that by placing those pearls around Rebecca's neck, I was not just giving her a family treasure, I was placing my trust into hands that would one day betray it. At that moment, though, I felt only pride. I believed I had done the right thing. And that is where the story truly begins, with a mother's sacrifice. Her faith and her hope that love was enough to build a lasting future. I held on to that hope as the wedding plans moved forward, but it did not take long before small cracks began to appear in the picture I had painted so carefully in my mind. One evening at dinner, Rebecca told us that her parents had disowned her. She spoke with a trembling voice about how her family could not accept her choice to marry Daniel because he was not from their social circle. Daniel's face tightened with pain, and he reached for her hand, promising her that she would never be without family again. His devotion made my heart ache with pride, yet something in the way Rebecca spoke felt rehearsed, as though the lines had been practiced in front of a mirror. I smiled, not wanting to cast a shadow over their happiness, but inside me a small doubt stirred. I began to notice other things as the weeks went by. Rebecca never used a credit card, always paying for everything with cash. When I asked her lightly why that was, she told me she did not trust banks. She said they were greedy and dishonest, and she preferred to keep her money where she could see it. Her answer came so quickly, almost too smoothly, and I nodded, but in my heart I thought about how unusual it was. A young woman working as a nurse living in this world without a bank account. It did not make sense. Still, Daniel laughed it off, calling her old-fashioned, and I kept my thoughts to myself. The more time I spent with them, the more little details unsettled me. One night, Rebecca told a story about her childhood, saying she had grown up in Texas. A week later, in front of the same group of friends, she mentioned Florida instead. Daniel brushed it away with a smile, saying she was just nervous or forgetful. He never seemed bothered, but I could not ignore the way the memories shifted from one place to another. Childhood stories do not usually change. They come from a place too deep to confuse. And then there were her eyes. When Daniel was looking at her, they were soft and full of warmth. But in those rare moments when his gaze was elsewhere, I caught glimpses of something different, something sharp and distant. It was there only for a second before her sweetness returned. But I saw it, and it left a chill inside me. I wanted so much to dismiss it, to tell myself I was being overprotective, maybe even unfair. Yet the feeling stayed. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sit by the window and replay those moments in my mind. The sad story about her family, the cash she carried everywhere, the childhood tales that never matched, and that fleeting look in her eyes. They did not fit together, no matter how I tried. I wanted to believe. I wanted to trust that the pearls I had given her were in safe hands, that Daniel had found the woman he needed. But in my heart, a whisper began to grow louder with each passing day. Something was not right. And though I tried to silence it, though I told myself again and again that love can make people complicated, I knew that whisper would not go away until I faced the truth. But in my heart, a whisper began to grow louder with each passing day. Something was not right. That whisper followed me one evening when I stopped by Daniel's apartment to drop off a box of small favours for the wedding. I had planned to leave them in the living room without disturbing anyone, just a quiet gesture from a mother who still wanted to help. The apartment was dim when I stepped inside, but I heard a voice drifting from the bedroom. It was Rebecca's. Her tone was not the sweet, gentle one she always used in front of us. It was sharp, low, and urgent. My first instinct was to call out to let her know I was there, but something in me froze. I stood in the hallway, clutching the box, and listened. "No, the wedding is still on schedule," she hissed. "Yes, I'll have access to his accounts once we're married. The old lady has already given us over 100 grand, and she'll probably hand over even more for a house down payment." I felt the blood drain from my face. My chest tightened as if I could not breathe. Then came the words that cut through me like a knife. "This Mark is worth at least 200,000, maybe more. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. He's completely hooked." She called my son a mark, a target, a prize to be taken. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she would hear it. My hands shook so badly that the box of favours almost slipped from my arms. Each word she spoke confirmed the fear that had been growing inside me. Rebecca was not a young woman in love. She was a predator, and my son, my only child, was the prey. I wanted to burst into that room and scream at her to drag her out and shake the truth in front of Daniel's eyes. But I knew if I moved too soon, she would twist the story, she would convince him that I was jealous or controlling. So I stepped back slowly, each movement careful until I reached the door. By the time I slid into my car, I was trembling so hard I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I drove 3 blocks and then had to pull over. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my body shaking with rage and disbelief. I pressed my hands to my face and sobbed. I had given everything $100,000, the necklace that had belonged to 4 generations of women, my trust, my hope, all of it. And to her, I was just an old fool, useful for money, nothing more. I do not know how long I sat there, but somewhere in the middle of my tears, a different feeling rose up, one I had not felt since the days when I fought for George through his cancer. A fire steady and fierce. I thought of my husband, of the promise I had made to protect our son. If Rebecca thought she could destroy Daniel and walk away with our money, she had chosen the wrong family. I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could not tell Daniel yet, not without proof. He was blinded by love, and she had already planted the idea that I was the enemy. No, I needed more than suspicion, more than what I had overheard. I needed undeniable evidence, and I was going to find it no matter what it took. That night, as I drove home through the dark streets of Charleston, I was no longer the woman who had sat by the window, whispering doubts to herself. I was a mother with a purpose, and I was ready to fight. The first thing I did when I got home was open my laptop and type in Private Investigator Charleston. My hands trembled as I scrolled through names, but one stood out: Patricia Hayes, a former police detective who now specialized in fraud cases. I called the number before I could lose my courage. The next morning, I met her at a small cafe downtown. Patricia was younger than me by at least 10 years, but she carried herself with the calm weight of someone who had seen more than her share of lies. She listened quietly as I poured out everything I had overheard, every detail that had led me here. When I finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me with steady eyes. "What you are describing, Mrs. Thompson, sounds like a romance scam with a marriage twist. These people are professionals. They study their victims, they learn what to say, and they become whoever you want them to be." My stomach dropped at her words, even though I already knew in my heart she was right. I slid a check across the table, more money I could hardly afford, and asked how long it would take. Patricia gave a faint smile and said not long, not for someone careless enough to use her real voice on the phone. 2 weeks later, she called me. Her voice was tight, careful, as if preparing me for a blow. "Margaret, you may want to sit down." I was in my kitchen making tea, and I gripped the counter with both hands. "The woman your son is engaged to is not Rebecca Miller. Her real name is Sarah Collins, 29 years old, from Tampa. She has been arrested 3 times for fraud. She works with partners, men who help her find targets, and sometimes pose as relatives." My knees nearly gave out beneath me. Patricia went on, her voice steady. "The man you heard on the phone, Marcus Rivera, was once her partner and lover. 2 years ago, she conned him out of $15,000 and disappeared. He has been trying to find her ever since." I pressed the phone harder to my ear, barely breathing. So it was all true, every dark suspicion. Sarah Collins had stolen not only our money, but our trust. And now she wanted my son's future as well. For a moment, I could not move. The kettle screamed on the stove, and I turned it off without even knowing what I was doing. Then, slowly, the weight of it began to settle. If Marcus had been looking for her, then he knew her better than anyone. He might be the one person who could help me expose her for what she really was. Patricia seemed to read my mind. "Do you want me to find him?" she asked. My answer came without hesitation. "Yes, find him." When I hung up, I sank into the chair by the window. My heart was heavy with shame that I had ever let Sarah near us, but mixed with that shame was something else, a new kind of strength. For the first time since George died, I did not feel entirely alone. I had Patricia on my side, and perhaps soon Marcus as well. If I was going to save Daniel, I would need allies. I looked out at the dark street and whispered to myself, "This fight has only just begun." I believed that with Patricia and soon Marcus, I would not be alone. But while I gathered my courage, Sarah was already moving her own pieces on the board. It started with a phone call Daniel received one afternoon. I was not there, but I learned about it later. A woman claiming to be Sarah's aunt spoke with him for nearly half an hour. She told Daniel that I had a history of controlling his life, that I had never accepted any of his girlfriends, that I would do anything to break up his happiness. None of it was true, but the words landed in his mind like poison. By the time he called me that night, I could hear the difference in his voice. Then, Sarah played her next card. She cried in Daniel's arms, telling him she was terrified I would try to ruin the wedding. She whispered, "If your mother comes to the ceremony, I will leave forever." She begged him to choose between peace with her or conflict with me. And my son, blinded by love and desperate to protect her, promised her that he would handle it. The call I got from Daniel broke my heart. He spoke calmly, but his words were sharper than any blade. "Mum," he said, "I need you to trust me. Please stop interfering. This is my wedding, not yours." He paused, then added, "If you really love me, you'll step back." Every word felt like a door closing between us. I tried to answer gently, reminding him that everything I had done was for him, but he was already slipping away. When the line went dead, I sat in my kitchen with the silence pressing in around me. I had carried him for 9 months, raised him for 32 years, given him every ounce of strength I had left, and now he believed I was the enemy. The tears came hot and fast. I gripped the table and sobbed like I had not sobbed since the day I buried George. The pain of losing my husband returned, only now it was mixed with the fear of losing my son as well. But even as my chest ached and my eyes burned, something inside me refused to break. I thought of Patricia's calm voice. I thought of the file she had gathered. I thought of Marcus Rivera, the man Sarah had betrayed, the man who might help me bring her down. Sarah may have my son's heart for now, but I still had the truth. And the truth, I told myself, will win. I wiped my face, reached for the phone and called Patricia. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled. "Tell me how to reach Marcus," I said. "Tell him I need to meet. It's time." As I hung up, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. The battle for my son's future had turned into a war of lies and tears, but I was ready to take the next step. If my son believes I am the villain, I told myself then, today, I will play that role. I will not ruin his happiness. I will ruin her scheme. I sat at the kitchen table, took a slow breath, and began. First, I called the venue. My voice was steady and warm, the voice of a mother who had decided to be gracious. "There has been a change," I said. "The bride's family will handle the remaining balance. Please pause my account and wait to hear from them directly." The coordinator sounded relieved, even cheerful, and asked for a number to confirm details. I gave her the one I knew Sarah used with vendors, the one she never answered unless it suited her. When the call ended, I stared at the silent phone for a long moment. One piece had moved. I placed the phone back to my ear. Then I called the florist. Same gentle tone, same simple message. The bride's family will take care of it. Please, hold all invoices for their approval. The florist thanked me for the update and said it was wonderful to see families come together. I smiled into the empty room and whispered, "Let us see how together they really are." Next came the caterer. I pictured the white linen and polished silver, the long tables and the neat cards with names. The way I had imagined Daniel's day would look. I thought of all the nights I had slept light, listening for the sound of his breath when he was a sick child, how I had learned the art of waiting. I used that same patience now. There has been a change, I said again. The bride's family will manage the final payment and confirm the menu. Please hold any charges to my account. The manager agreed politely. With every call, I felt a small part of my strength return. She had taken my trust and my money and had set her sights on my son's future. Today, I was taking back the ground under her feet. The photographer was next, then the band. I kept my voice calm, never sharp, never angry. I knew Sarah wanted a clean path to the altar, a path built on my savings and my kindness. I was laying down small stones. Instead, stones she would trip over one by one. When the last call ended, the house fell quiet. The quiet pressed in on me, but it did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a room where a plan had been made. I poured a glass of water and held it between my hands. "George," I said softly, "forgive me if this looks cruel. Our boy may hate me for a while, but I cannot stand by and watch him be led to a life built on lies." I set the glass down and let the truth rise in me. If Daniel thought I was trying to control him, then so be it. Let him believe that for a little while. Better a mother who is blamed today than a son who is ruined for years to come. The phone rang once that afternoon. It was the venue cheerful again, asking when they might expect to hear from the bride's family. I told them soon, then ended the call and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. I knew that by the next morning, as bills and questions piled up on the wrong doorstep, the vendors would begin to press. I pictured Sarah's face when she realised that her front had shifted, that the easy flow of money had turned into a wall. She would have to call, to scramble to explain. And she would not be able to do it without leaving marks for others to see. As the sun began to fall, doubt came knocking. What if this only made Daniel turn further away? What if he never forgave me? I stood at the window and watched the light fade from the street and told myself the truth. Love is not always soft. Sometimes love is the hand that pulls you back from the edge even when you fight against it. I took out a small notebook and wrote down each call I had made, each person I'd spoken to, each promise they had given. Not to cover myself, though, that mattered, but to steady my mind. I was not flailing anymore. I had a list, I had a plan, and I had a reason that would not bend. I remembered the feel of the pearls in my hand the night I gave them to her, how smooth and cool they were, how proud I felt. I let that memory burn, not to hurt me, but to make me clear. I could not get back the money I had spent or the trust I had handed over. But I could stop the rest of it. I could slow her down. I could force the truth out into the light. When I finally sat down, the house was dark and still. I folded my hands and closed my eyes. Tomorrow the calls would begin, not from me, but to her. Tomorrow the people who made weddings happen would ask for what was owed, and she would realise that the woman she had called a foolish old lady had reached into the heart of her little show and pulled out the pins. I opened my eyes and felt something rare and strong move through me. It was not anger, though anger had started this. It was not fear, though fear still lived in me. It was resolve, quiet, steady, and ready. The first move was made. The next would be bolder, I reached for the phone again, not to call a vendor, but to check for a message from Patricia. We would need Marcus soon. We would need a witness who knew Sarah by her real name and her real face. My son thought I was the problem. Let him think that a few days longer. In the end, he would see who had been protecting him all along. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. The fight had begun in silence. It would end in the open where everyone could see. I did not expect the open to arrive so soon. The gates of the Bellamy estate stood wide when I walked up the gravel path. The gardens bright and trimmed as if the whole place had been ironed. I chose a simple black dress and a quiet smile, planning to slip into a back pew, offer my blessing in silence, and leave before anyone noticed I had ever been there. I had not made it 3 steps inside before she cut me off. Rebecca stood at the entrance to the hall with a bouquet on her arm and sweetness on her face that turned sharp the moment her eyes found mine. "What are you even doing here? You were uninvited yesterday." Her voice rang out clean and bright, and every head tilted toward us like flowers following the sun. For a heartbeat, I could not move. I felt 100 looks on my shoulders. Then I saw my son behind her, beautiful in his tuxedo hands at his sides, eyes lowered. He did not say a word. Not Mom. Not wait. Not anything. He held himself very still, as if my absence were a choice he had already made. The hurt came fast, like heat on skin. I stood there in the doorway with all those faces facing me and thought, so this is how it is. The bride with a public smile and a private blade. The son who will not meet his mother's eyes. Someone near the aisle whispered that I should be ashamed. Another lifted a phone to film, and somewhere to my left, a kind neighbour clutched her purse and looked down, afraid to be seen caring. I took a breath that shook and steadied. "I am sorry for the disturbance," I said. "I will go." I spoke softly, but the words carried. I turned without asking for one more glance, because I knew if I begged for even a second of my son's attention, I would not be able to walk away with my head up. I made it back to the corridor, cool air on my face, and leaned a hand against the wall until the room stopped spinning. Pain rose like a tide, then broke and left me standing. If my son thinks I am the villain, then I will be the quiet kind, the kind who walks out and saves him in another way. I took out my phone with fingers that still trembled and typed a message to Patricia. "On schedule. Keep your end steady." Then I saved the number she had sent me for Marcus and placed the phone back in my bag. When I reached the side door, the grounds were suddenly very noisy. A man from the florist hurried past with worry on his face. A woman from the catering staff spoke into a headset and asked for a credit card she could not get, and the event coordinator called a number again and again that went straight to a recording. I kept walking, my steps slow and even, and told myself to breathe. The plan was not built on shouting at a doorway. It was built on patience and proof and the weight of truth dropping in the right place at the right time. Still, as I reached the parking lot, the shame rose once more, and I had to stand very still to master it. I thought of the night I had given her the pearls. I thought of Daniel's smile before grief lived in his eyes. I thought of George and the promise I made to love our son, even when loving him meant being the person he could not stand. Then I wiped my face, opened the car, and sat with my hands on the wheel until the tears cleared and the road ahead came back into focus. The phone buzzed in my bag. It was the venue, cheerful but strained, asking when they might expect payment from the bride's family. "Soon," I said. "They will be in touch directly." When I ended the call, the quiet filled the car like water poured into a glass. I let it rise and settle. Somewhere behind me, music drifted from the hall strings, warming the air, and guests laughed the way people do when everything is still pretend. I pictured Rebecca pale as sugar under the lights, counting on my kindness to carry her across the finish line, and I felt something harden inside me. If you think I will fight you in the doorway, I thought then you do not know me at all. I fight where it matters. I fight where you cannot charm the room. I checked the time, then the message thread with Patricia. We had agreed on a window. We had a name, a past, and a voice that would be recognised. For now, my part was to be the woman they all believed me to be, the one who left quietly. Before I drove away, I looked once more toward the hall. I did not look for my son. The looking would only take what little strength I had left. Instead, I prayed that when the truth came, it would be strong enough to reach him where my words could not. I turned the key pulled onto the road and kept my eyes forward. I would not forget the sting of that doorway. I would use it. Pain can break you, or it can make a path. I chose the path. The fight had begun in silence. It would end in the open, and when it did, everyone would see exactly who had stood for love, and who had used the word to take and take and take. I parked 2 streets away and slipped back through the garden entrance. I knew by heart the one near the catering doors. I moved along the side of the chapel and stood behind a marble column at the very back, close enough to see Daniel at the altar and the guests rising as the music swelled. The doors opened. Rebecca stepped into the aisle in a white dress, my family's pearls bright against her throat. For a breath, I could not look away from those pearls. 4 generations. My mother's hands, my grandmother's voice, my promise to George. Then I felt the phone in my palm. It vibrated once, as if reminding me of who I was and why I was there. I typed one word to Marcus, now. The sound of his steps cut through the music, like a new note nobody expected. He pushed the doors wide and walked straight down the aisle with a steady pace that did not need anger to be strong. His eyes never left the woman in white. Sarah Collins, did you really think you could hide forever? The room went still, so still that I heard someone's breath catch and the flowers tremble against their vases. The bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the floor. Daniel moved on, instinct stepping in front of her, his arm outstretched as if he could hold back a storm with a sleeve of black cloth. "Sir, you have the wrong person," he said, but his voice did not sound sure. Marcus shook his head and opened a thin folder. He did not wave it like a prop. He simply held up what mattered. Photographs, the same face with different hair, different cities, different names. A print out of a public record, the kind you cannot sweet talk into changing. And then the recording. A few seconds of her voice that leapt out into the quiet and left nowhere to hide. "No, the wedding is still on schedule. Yes, I'll have access to his accounts once we're married. The old lady has already given us over 100 grand. This mark is worth at least 200,000. The words moved through the pews like cold air. Someone gasped. Someone whispered my name. I stood very still and felt my heart crack and reset itself in the same beat. Daniel turned toward Rebecca. He did not speak, but the question was on his face. She reached for him. "Andrew," she said, and then corrected herself in a rush. "Daniel, baby, they are lying. Please, they are jealous. Your mother hates me. She is trying to ruin us." Marcus raised the phone again. "There is more." A clipped laugh hers. "The old bat is so desperate for grandchildren she'll believe anything. The son is a mama's boy. I just have to cry about my tragic past and he writes another check." A low moan went through the room, like pain in a single body. Daniel flinched as if the sound had struck him. He looked from Marcus to Rebecca and then past them to me at the back, as if only now remembering I was there. His face was white, then red, then pale again. He took one slow step toward her, Is it true? He asked, and his voice had the quiet of a man who wants one last chance to be wrong about what he already knows. She shook her head, tears bright and beautiful on her cheeks. People make mistakes, she said softly. I am not that person anymore. Your mother never wanted us to be happy. Please let us start fresh. I watched my son take in the words, and for a moment I feared that kindness would win against truth. Then his eyes fell to her throat. The pearls. He reached up with careful fingers, touched the clasp and paused. The room held its breath. When the clasp snapped, it was a small sound, but it carried like a bell. He lowered the necklace into his palm and turned. His steps toward me were slow, steady, and full of something I had prayed to see again. When he reached the back, he did not try to smile. He placed the pearls into my hands. True love does not need to steal to survive. He said, every word clear. This belongs to our family. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the truth standing where lies had stood a moment before. I felt the familiar weight of the necklace settle into my hands, and with it a weight I had carried alone begin to lift. I did not look at Sarah. I looked at my son, and I saw a man making a choice with his eyes open. He walked back to the front and faced her. You lied about your name, your past, my mother, and about me, he said, and though his voice shook, it did not break. If there is anything left to say, it needs to be the truth. She opened her mouth, but the room had shifted. Guests who had watched me walk out at the door now watched her and saw what I had seen weeks ago. The crack behind the sweetness, the cold behind the smile. Patricia had moved closer to the aisle. She did not speak, but her presence was another quiet fact in a sea of noise. Marcus lowered his phone. He had said enough. I closed my hands around the pearls and stood a little taller. 4 women before me had worn them with pride. Tonight, they were a promise kept. A few people started to clap soft at first, then stopped unsure. Daniel lifted a hand for quiet. His face was wet, but his eyes were clear. There will be no wedding today, he said. I am sorry for the trouble, and I thank you for coming. Please take the dinner and the music if you wish, but this ceremony is over. He looked at me again, and in that look was an apology he had not yet found words for. I nodded once so he would not have to speak it in front of everyone. Behind him, Rebecca swayed as if the ground had shifted. She found her voice again and tried to throw one last rope. They staged this, she cried, pointing at me. She hired that man to pretend. Do not let her control you. Believe me. Believe us. The room stirred uncertain, but the doubt she hoped for did not take root the way it once would have. Too much had been said aloud. Too much had been seen. I kept my place at the back pearls in my hands and let the truth breathe. The open had arrived, and under its light, the story we had all been living began to change. That was when she lunged for the last thread she had left. She pointed down the aisle at me with a shaking hand and shouted that I had hired a man to pretend to be Marcus, that I had staged the whole thing to break them apart, that I was jealous, controlling, and would rather see my son alone than happy without me. The room rippled with voices. Some people gasped. Others started to argue in low tones. A few lifted their phones again as if their screens could tell them what to believe. I saw faces I knew turning toward me with pity or doubt, and faces I did not know looking for the easy answer that would let them sit back down and clap. Daniel's eyes flicked from her to Marcus, and then back to me. He took a step, then stopped, as if one more inch would pull him into a place he could never leave. Mum, he said, his voice hushed like a boy who had just found a crack in the floor and feared what was underneath. Did you do this? Did you bring this man here? For a moment, I could not speak. My throat closed and heat stung my eyes. I felt every year of my life and every mile I had walked for him. I let the tears fall and did not wipe them away. Then I lifted my chin and answered so he could hear me, and so the room could hear me, not with anger, not with a list of my wounds, but with the one thing I knew he still trusted from me. Love does not need lies, I said each word slow and even. Look into her eyes, son, and you will see. I did not try to convince the crowd. I did not argue with strangers. I gave my son a place to stand. Sarah laughed brittle and bright and talked fast about how photos can be stolen, and files can be doctored, and voices can be cut together. She told the guests that people on the internet make a living destroying happy couples, that an old woman with money and time could do anything if she wanted to be the only woman in her son's life. It was a neat story, and she threw it like a net over the room. For a heartbeat, I felt it catch. Then real life tugged back. The coordinator slipped in through a side door and whispered to Sarah with a tight face. The florist moved to the aisle and hovered, not wanting to interrupt but needing an answer. A server leaned into a corner to make a quiet call, and I heard the words, "Final payment," and declined. Sarah's phone buzzed in her bouquet, and then again in her hand when she snatched it out. She tried to silence it, but the buzzing returned a stubborn little truth that would not stay quiet. Daniel heard it too. He watched her fumble with the screen, watched the colour rise in her cheeks and the way her eyes slid off his when she said she would handle it later. You said your family was taking care of everything. Someone near the front called, and another person echoed it, and then another. It was not anger that moved through the pews now. It was a slow waking. Marcus did not speak. He had already said enough. Patricia stood still, hands folded, letting the room breathe. I kept my place at the back, the pearls warm in my palms, and I held Daniel's gaze when he finally looked at me again. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I only let him see that I was steady. He turned to Sarah, and for a long second, he did nothing at all. I watched my son weigh the world in front of him, and I heard my own breath the way I used to hear his when he was a baby sleeping on my chest. Then he asked her a question so simple it sounded like mercy. Is there anything here that is not true? She said yes at once, of course all of it, most of it, enough of it, words tumbling into one another until they no longer meant a thing. The coordinator stepped closer, voice low but firm, and asked again for a working number for the bride's family for a card that would clear. The florist held out a tablet. The bandleader cleared his throat and looked down at his sheet. Sarah snapped that this was not the time could they not see she was being attacked, and the snap landed like a slap in a church. The crowd did not gasp this time. They listened. They watched. They saw. I felt the ache in my chest ease just a little. I had not won anything. Not yet. But a door was opening. I spoke once more for Daniel alone. I love you, I said. Whatever you decide today, my love for you is the same. But do not let a lie tell you what love is. He closed his eyes and breathed out, and when he opened them, I saw less fear and more light. Sarah tried one last time, her voice softening into the shape it had worn for months, telling him they could start over somewhere new, that this was our wedding day, and none of them mattered. The phone buzzed again in her hand. The coordinator waited. The guests waited. The room itself seemed to wait. And then, from the doorway, came the sound of shoes, on stone firm, and even drawing every head around in one motion. I did not move. I only put my hand over the pearls and stood as straight as my mother taught me. Whatever entered that room next, I knew the ground beneath us had already changed. The truth was no longer a whisper. It had a shape and a place to stand. The doors behind me opened with a firm sweep, and the sound of shoes on stone carried down the aisle. 2 agents stepped into the light and asked for quiet in voices that did not need to be loud. The room stilled as if a thread had been pulled through it. They confirmed her name with calm questions and sure eyes, then spoke the words I had been praying to hear. "Sarah Collins, you are under arrest for federal fraud, identity theft, and related financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent." A murmur moved through the pews, then stopped. She drew herself up as if a title could shield her, and cried out that she was the bride today, that this was her day, that none of this could be happening. The taller agent met her panic with a steady gaze and answered in a voice that felt like a door closing softly. "No. Today, you are a defendant." The room seemed to exhale. The bouquet slipped from her hand and rolled against a pew. She took a step back, and then another voice climbing into pleas and protests, but the words had lost their power. The agents moved with simple care, not rough, not unkind, and took her wrists. The cuffs clicked, and for a moment all I could see was the bright white dress and the small silver that held it still. My heart did not leap. It settled. Around us, people who had filmed and whispered began to lower their phones and lift their heads. A few clapped not a cheer, but a grateful sound, and then others joined them with a kind of relief that made my throat ache. I felt the pearls warm in my hands and pressed them once as if to say we made it back. Patricia stood near the aisle with her file tucked away, her eyes gentle. Marcus let out a long breath and found the wall with his shoulder. I looked toward my son and found him looking at me. His face was wet and unguarded, like the boy I had watched sleep on so many nights when he was small and feverish. He did not try to speak. He only nodded, once a slow apology that I received with all the grace I had left. I gave him a small nod in return so he would not have to say more in front of everyone. The coordinator stepped close to the agents and confirmed the simple facts of the day, her voice now steady where it had been frayed, and the vendors exchanged quiet looks that told their own story. The lie that had filled this place could not hold. The agents turned with her between them. She looked over her shoulder, reaching for Daniel with her eyes and calling his name with the voice that had fooled us all. But he did not move. He kept his hands at his sides and held his ground. The doors closed behind them, and the music inside me finally stopped shaking. For the first time in weeks, I drew a full breath. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and grateful, like someone who had carried a heavy box down a long set of stairs and could at last set it down. I wiped my face and stepped forward a little so Daniel would not have to cross the entire room to reach me if he wanted to. He did not come at once. He walked to the front and turned to the guests with his shoulders squared, as if the suit finally fit the man he was. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice clear but soft. "There will be no wedding today. The reception is prepared and the food is ready. If you wish to stay for dinner and the music, please do. I am sorry for the trouble." The words were simple and kind and right. They matched the man I had hoped he would be. A wave of low talk rose and fell as people began to stand, some to leave quietly, some to step forward and touch his arm. He looked for me then, and when he found me, he did not hide what was on his face. I closed the distance halfway so he would not have to carry all of it alone. We did not speak yet because the time for long words had not come, but we stood near enough to show that the space between us was not broken beyond repair. I lifted the pearls a little and he breathed out as if he had brought them home himself. "Thank you," I said in a voice meant only for him. He glanced at the empty doorway and back at me, and I saw that the last of the doubt had left his eyes. He was hurt, yes, and shaken, yes, but he was no longer blind. I pressed his arm and let my hand fall. There would be questions, there would be hard nights, but he was safe, and I was no longer alone in the truth. We moved together from the quiet of the chapel into the soft light of the reception hall. the music turned down low, the tables already set, the flowers still fragrant even after all that had happened. People stood in small circles speaking in careful voices. Then the circles opened as Daniel walked to the front and took the microphone with both hands. He did not try to be grand. He thanked everyone for coming and said there would be no wedding today, that anyone who wished to stay for dinner and music was welcome, that he was sorry for the trouble, and then he turned toward me and spoke to the room as if it were one person who needed to hear him. He said he had doubted his mother, and that those doubts had hurt her, and he asked forgiveness. He did not hide behind pretty words. He stood there with a steady voice and told the truth. He said there had been a night when Rebecca spoke in her sleep and said the name Marcus, that he had felt a small alarm, but pushed it down because he wanted to believe in love, and because believing in love felt safer than facing how lonely he had been since his father died. The room fell still in that gentle way a room does when people recognize their own weakness in someone else. I walked to him and laid my hand on his arm so he would not feel alone under all those eyes. I said that love is never a mistake. The mistake is trusting the wrong person with it, and I meant every word. I did not want my son to carry the weight of shame for loving badly. I wanted him to keep the kind of heart that can still love well. He nodded, and I saw his shoulders ease as if something heavy had finally slipped off. Marcus came by and shook his hand a quiet grip, and a look that said, "Be smart from here," then he faded into the edge of the room. Patricia met my eyes and promised to follow through on every paper we needed, then she too stepped back to give us space. People began to approach in ones and twos. A neighbour apologised for judging me at the door. A cousin of Daniel's hugged us both and said she had never seen anything like today and hoped never to see it again. The band shifted into something easy and honest, not a march but a low tune that matched the mood. The servers began to pour coffee and set plates, and the tightness in the room loosened as guests sat down and let the talk turn to ordinary things work, and children and who had travelled how far to be there. It did not feel like a wedding, but it felt like a family gathering, and that was its own kind of blessing. I slipped the pearls into a small velvet box and kept it near my heart. I told Daniel that one day when he found a woman worthy of them, I would fasten the clasp myself, and he smiled in a way I had not seen since before grief found him. He moved through the room with a calm that surprised me, speaking to each table, thanking people for their kindness, answering hard questions without anger. I watched him and felt a quiet pride, not the pride of a big event or a fine suit, but the pride of seeing a man stand back up after a fall and choose to be decent. Near the doorway, a young woman I recognised from years ago stopped to tell him she was glad he was all right. Her voice soft and kind, and when she walked away, Daniel watched her go with a thoughtful look that did not reach for anything too fast. Hope does not have to run. It can just stand nearby and breathe. As the night drew on, I found a quiet corner and let my body rest. The laughter around me sounded real, not the loud kind people use to cover what hurts. I thought of what we had lost and what we had saved, and I folded my hands over the velvet box as if it were a promise I could keep. When Daniel reached me, he took my hand and kissed my cheek and thanked me again, not for the plan or the proof, but for loving him when it made me look like the villain. I told him that a mother does not count the cost when her child is at risk, and that I would do it all again if I had to, though I prayed I would never have to. We stood for a moment side by side and looked out over a room that had been meant for vows and had become a place for truth. It was not the day we planned, but it was the day we needed. I could feel that truth as Daniel and I stepped to a small table by the window where the lights were soft and the noise of the room faded to a gentle hum. He picked up 2 small glasses and handed one to me, his hand warm and steady in a way that told me the storm had passed. We stood close, mother and son, and for a moment We simply breathed. Then I lifted my glass and he lifted his, and together we said, "Here's to family and knowing when to fight for the people you love." The words felt right in my mouth, simple and strong, and when we drank, I tasted relief more than anything else. He smiled at me, not the bright smile he wears for others, but the quiet one I first knew when he was a boy, proud of something done well. I touched his sleeve and told him I was proud of him now, not for ending a wedding, but for facing the truth and standing up with kindness when it would have been easier to shout. He leaned in and whispered, "Thank you," and I could hear his father in the way he said it, that soft weight of gratitude that marks a good man. People began to leave in clusters, coats over their arms, voices lowered out of respect. Some stayed to share coffee and warm food, and the kind of talk that mends small places. Near the doorway, a woman I had not seen in years paused. Emily Carter. She had dated Daniel in college, a good girl with gentle eyes who used to bring cinnamon bread to our porch. She came over and clasped my hands and asked if we were all right, her face open with care. Then she turned to Daniel, and the way she looked at him was not pity, not fear, just worry, mixed with warmth, the kind you offer when you still wish a person well. I stepped back half a pace and let them talk. They did not trade promises or plans. They spoke softly about work and how strange life can be. And when she said she was glad he was safe, he thanked her like a man who understood what that meant. After she left, he watched the door for a second, and then shook his head with a small smile, the kind that says, "I am not rushing anywhere tonight." Hope does not have to be loud to be real. It can stand a few feet away and breathe without forcing its way in. I opened the velvet box in my hands and lifted the pearls just enough to feel their weight, then closed the lid and held it against my heart. I told Daniel that when he found someone worthy, I would fasten the clasp myself. He nodded, not as a child seeking approval, but as a man hearing a promise he could grow into. He moved through the room again, thanking guests with calm grace, answering hard questions without blame, and when he returned to me, his face was tired but clear. We walked the length of the hall together, saying goodnight to the band and the staff, and with each step, the shape of the day settled into its place. This had not been a celebration, but it had been a gathering of truth. At the door, Evelyn from next door squeezed my hand and said I had done the hard right thing. I told her that any mother in my shoes would have tried. She shook her head and said not everyone would have had the courage to do it in the light. When the room was nearly empty, Daniel and I sat for a minute at a corner table and let the quiet come. He asked if I was all right to drive, and I teased him that I had been driving his whole life. He laughed, and the sound of it smoothed out the last rough edge in me. We stood and looked out across the flowers that had outlasted their purpose and the place cards that would not be used, and I did not feel bitter. I felt grateful we had escaped the wrong future and saved the right one, even if it was not yet clear what that would be. At the threshold, I placed the velvet box back into my bag and wrapped my arm through my son's. The night air was cool on my face. I thought of George, and I told him quietly that the pearls were safe and our boy was safe too. The day had asked more of us than we thought we had, and still, somehow we had found enough. I squeezed Daniel's arm and he squeezed mine back. No speeches, no grand vows, just the easy language of a family that has been tested and did not break. We turned toward home, and with each step, I felt the weight of the necklace rest where it belonged. Not on any neck tonight, but in the hands that would know when to give it. On the drive back, I watched the streetlights pass, and let the quiet tell me what words could not. We had been hurt, and we had not broken. We had been fooled, and we had learned. There is a kind of pain that tells you you were foolish, and a kind of truth that says you are simply human. If you are listening and carrying your own ache, hear me now. You are not the sum of the harm someone did to you. You are not weak for wanting love. You are not to blame for another person's lies. The way forward begins small. It begins with one deep breath that you do not rush. It begins with drinking water and eating something warm even when your heart is not hungry. It begins with a call to a friend who will not judge you, or a walk around the block where the air can touch your face and remind you the world is larger than one hard day. Some of us pray and find comfort there. Some of us write in a journal not to be poetic, but to put pain on paper so it stops circling the mind. Some of us sit with a counsellor and learn how to steady our thoughts when fear tries to run the room. Some of us join a small group, a church circle, a community class, or an online forum where stories are shared and shame begins to loosen. Some of us try gentle practices at home, a simple stretch in the morning, a few minutes of quiet breathing before sleep, a promise to turn off the phone an hour earlier so the heart can rest. Some of us set small boundaries that protect our peace, like keeping our money and our passwords safe, asking a second pair of eyes before we sign something important, taking time to meet a partner's people, and letting time show us what charm can hide. None of this erases what happened. It teaches the heart how to stand again without growing hard. Tonight, as I put the pearls away and locked the house, I could hear George in the old sweet places of the rooms. I told him that our boy was safe, and that I had done my best, and I felt him near in the quiet, the way you do when love has been true. Daniel carried his own weight up those front steps, but I saw in his face the kind of strength that does not need to pretend. We will have hard talks and soft meals. We will answer questions we wish we did not have to answer. We will laugh sooner than we expect and cry later than we plan. That is how healing goes. It moves like weather. It changes, but it comes back around, and each time it leaves a little more light behind. If your life has cracked in some place, you are not alone. There are people who will sit with you until morning. There are hands that will hold yours at the clinic office or the support group or the kitchen table. There are neighbours who will bring soup. There are strangers who will become friends because they heard your story and saw themselves in it. Do not rush. Do not punish yourself for needing time. Forgive yourself for not seeing what you could not have known. Let love be patient with you while you learn to be patient with yourself. I will keep the pearls until the day comes when they belong around the neck of a woman who honours our family with open hands. Until then, they are a reminder that what we protect matters more than what we lose. If this story met you in a tender place, I am glad you were here with me. If it helped you feel seen, stay a while. We share stories like this so no one has to carry their pain in the dark. You are welcome to come back for the next one, and if you wish, subscribe so you do not miss it. Take care of yourself tonight. Breathe, drink water, rest. Morning is on its way.